Hello and welcome to The Real Bottom Line, the podcast for entrepreneurs featuring entrepreneurs. But we're going to deviate a little bit from that today because we're going to talk to Gord Stevens. He is currently the Chief Operating Officer at the Halifax Partnership, and he has an interesting journey in and out of entrepreneurship. Welcome, Gord.
Hey, Wendy, nice to be here.
So lovely to have you as well. Maybe you could tell our audience a little bit about your journey, like how you started your career, what brought you into entrepreneurship, and then ultimately what took you back out.
Sure, although I would argue that I'm not
Oh,
actually
good.
out.
All right.
We'll get there. So grew up in a small town in Cape Breton, where my family ran a grocery store for almost 100 years,
Wow.
and so the entrepreneurship was kind of from cradle to grave. I
Baked
think
in.
for most of us in the family, but went to university here in Halifax, and wasn't going to go back into the family business, and so really carved out a career in finance and accounting. Did that for about 10 years, and then we had lived offshore and came back to Canada just after 9/11. Our daughter was born a couple of weeks after 9/11. We were living in New Jersey at the time, and it was just we were just unsettled where we were.
Mm-hmm.
So came back to Halifax, worked in corporate finance here for a year, and then that young daughter became sick, and I wanted to have some more flexibility in my life, and so did the thing that is guaranteed to make you work more. Decided to become an entrepreneur, but I could set my own schedule,
Yeah.
and so we had always looked at the coffee shop world. We did a 25,000 kilometer drive one summer, visiting every coffee shop from Halifax to Key West to LA to San Francisco
Oh
and
my
back
goodness.
across Canada. But had a relatively successful career in finance, and it always felt like a bit of a step backward to then go into the coffee business. So when we did decide to uh, go the entrepreneurial route, it was I'd always planned on doing multiple startups in that vein, uh, and so we did. We did uh, Uncommon Grounds and Rum Runners the first, like within 3 months of each other. Then did two more Uncommon Grounds in the first 12 months. A couple years later, we opened up Sugar. A couple of years later, we opened up Uncommon Kids and Carbon Stock. A couple of years after that, we did Lost Cod. Um, and so, it kind of the um, the evolution of what we were doing was a bit haphazard, in that we were going from food service to retail to online and corporate business, um, but they all had connection to a story, a place. That I was always driven by the way the customer reacts to a product or a store or a story, and sort of wove that into everything that we did, which ended up making the route harder. When you were opening up a coffee shop, everyone said, "Okay, well, you go to Cisco and you get your frozen muffins, and this is what everybody does." And I'm like, "Well, don't want to do what everyone does."
Right.
So we did a scratch bakery for Uncommon Grounds, and 22 years later, that's still the case. Rum Runners, we created something that had never even existed in Canada, and then built a complete story around prohibition to market it. Sugar, again, I sent myself through a week long candy making class at the Culinary Institute, and because I didn't want to start something that I couldn't do myself, or at least know when somebody was pulling the wool over on me.
Well, what's interesting is as you're explaining all this, it's less. the types of business more than the how you wanted to run those business was the common thread in
It's
terms of
true. Yeah.
fresh, not done before, not following the regular road that most people follow on these things.
Yeah. Hence the uncommon.
That's right. The name of
Um,
the company. Yeah.
yeah. And so, again, we just kept going through this and going through it. Eventually, not everything was successful. So a couple of things disappeared over time. But then as our kids got through college and started university, my wife wanted to get back to the workforce. She had
Oh,
stayed home, raised the kids the whole time. And it was at that point that I had been about 15 or 16 years in it, and decided maybe I should look for a job again. But at the same time, didn't want to give up all of our businesses. So she came in to run them, but then in the first 6 months or so, we sold off Sugar, Rum Runners, Lost Cod, sold one of the locations of the coffee shop, and just made it a bit more manageable. And then I really started to focus on what we could do uh, in my last role with Develop Nova Scotia. How do we create an environment for entrepreneurs, for local businesses to thrive on the Halifax waterfront in places like Peggy's Cove and Lunenburg, and work with them to help their businesses evolve, as opposed to just being a typical landlord tenant relationship.
what would you say that you learned from those multiple locations that has is translating into your work today? Like, what are the key lessons that you're trying to cause shift, increase impact, and help other entrepreneurs? What are those key lessons?
I mean, I think it's, for me, it comes down to differentiation.
Mm.
So whether that's your product or your place or your story, being able to have something that is unique and that is uniquely you, that you can, hold your hand to your heart and just feel good about the what you're selling and what you're trying to do. It's and I found the best way to express that, especially to customers, was through storytelling.
Mm.
And so it was a lot of from the point of sale materials around the products to the website to social media platforms, and back 10 years ago or 12 years ago, we used to do a lot of email marketing, and every one of those started with a story, and told a story either about the product or about small businesses or Nova Scotia, make some connection between the consumer, what we were selling, and some emotion in them.
Interesting. How would you compare and contrast storytelling with brand building? Or is it just a different nuance?
I think brand building is a bigger umbrella,
Yeah.
and storytelling is one way to go about building that brand.
Interesting. So, when you let go of Sugar and Rum Runners and the locations and things like that, what did you learn through the process of selling your businesses? Did you engage a broker? Did you find them locally? Like, what was the process that you went through as a seller to maximize the value you got out of those?
We didn't use a broker. We had talked to a couple, didn't really get the sense that there was, um, in our particular instance, I don't think there was going to be a lot of value added
Mm.
through that. So we found the buyers locally. One was a new Canadian, but they were resident in Halifax at the time. And really just tried to create a clear picture of the operations to date.
Mhm.
Strip away any of the noise around the financial statements and things like that, and make the case for the valuation that you're looking for. At the end of the day, you need to be um, you need to be flexible and realistic. I think a lot of people sometimes have a number in their mind that they want to get, but it may have absolutely no correlation to the business. But if I want to retire, I need to have $5 million, so my business is worth $5 million. Like, well,
Yeah.
it might be worth 50, and it might be worth 500,000.
It is
Um,
interesting how often the value is tied to the capital gains exemption level.
yeah, 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 yeah. So anyway, it was. Different processes for different businesses, different types of buyers. Again, some of them were a bit more required more creativity
Is that from a
on the new
financing
owner.
perspective, or was it just
No, no, just like to operate them. Right, there was like Lost Cod sort of needed sort of um, um, constant new ideas to keep the product
so it's
fresh.
almost like you had to profile the business and find a buyer that matched that profile for them to be successful.
Yeah,
Did you do any vendor take back?
in an ideal world, that is exactly what would have happened. We did not. We did not do a vendor take back. No.
Okay. Did you find that was something requested, or and you just were able to negotiate it out? Because I'm hearing more and
Uh,
more that there's a almost like it's to be expected. There's going to be some BTV, you know?
yeah, it. I think if you're requesting or if you're seeking a high valuation, I think it's more likely that you're going to be asked for a VTB.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think more often than not, it's the it's the excess that the owner is getting above where they thought they had to be, that they're willing to take as a VTB.
Right.
Right. So if they thought the business was worth 1 million, or they were going to be happy with 1 million, and somebody offered them 1.2, they'll gladly take a $200,000 VTB.
Right.
And maybe they get it, maybe they don't, but they really don't have a lot of emotional attachment to that VTB.
What was the hardest part about the sales process for you? Did you ever feel like these businesses were your baby, or were they always kind of looked at as an asset that you were nurturing and building value in? Like, what was your mindset around that?
No, they were always my babies, because we didn't because there was so much of my own personality and my own creativity that went into them. Again, like we didn't, if it was a widget factory and we made 10 million widgets a year, and sold it, I probably wouldn't look back the next day. But some of them, there was, you know, especially Lost Cod. There was, if we had 80 designs, there were 80 stories that
Yeah.
I individually researched and were tied to different parts of Nova Scotia. And those stories really resonated with customers. And so, it that gave me great satisfaction owning it, and then just made the breakup that much harder.
The breakup. I feel like it's a little bit like your kids. Like now they're off at school and they're off living
Yeah.
their own world. And do you still go by and see them, the locations that they're
They are actually not around anymore as of a couple months ago. Yeah,
right?
they were sold again and rebranded.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, that must have been hurtful as well when you see them rebrand.
You
Or
know,
was it the distance enough that that
the
emotion
distance
was
was
a
enough.
little gone? Yeah.
The distance was enough. Yeah.
So when you were running those operations, one of the things we talk to entrepreneurs about, in terms of freedom, because there's money freedom, but there's also time freedom. And a lot of people build their businesses around them so that they're doing
Mhm.
like, it's almost like everything has to go through them, and they become such an integral component of the business that it's very hard for them to walk away and find a seller, because sometimes people don't want to buy jobs.
Yeah.
So how was that process for you? Because it sounds like you've been intricately involved. How did you pull back on that? When did you start doing that? How did you build your systems?
Um, at the operational level, I always had managers in each location, which made it much easier to walk away. And the as I said before, it was more the creativity and the growth
Mhm.
piece of it that I was intricately involved with, and that's the type of thing that a new owner needs to they need to embody that. They're not buying a job, but they're buying an investment that they need to work.
Yes.
And So it was that aspect of it that um, it you can put into it as much as you want, and you get out of it as much as you put into it. Whereas the day to day operations, you really need, I didn't need to make every latte that was being
Or order the
served.
order the milk.
Yeah, but from day one, I insisted on standing in each one of those roles and doing each one of those roles so that, again, like I was very familiar with what was required, where the bottlenecks were, what could we do to improve efficiencies, negotiating with suppliers and things like that, finding new suppliers, finding new products, all of that. I never let go of any of that.
When it came to building the culture of each of those places, it sounds like, was there a common culture, or did each thing kind of, each entity almost create its own based on what was going on?
For the most part, it was a common culture, and we, at any given point in time, we would have had 70 or 80 staff, but a lot of them would cross over between the operations. So
Mm.
especially the seasonal businesses on the waterfront, if you had someone good there, or even someone okay, you probably needed them in the winter somewhere else. So the cultures melded that way.
Mhm.
um, but it was also, we always hired, um, young, primarily students. Um, and for, the first few years, that meant everybody was young, but, we now have people who've been with us for 15 years. And, so it's a little different now than it was 10 or 15 years ago, but it's evolved naturally.
What do you think was the trick, or what was the thing that you found in the employees, and how did you find it that made the in the successful ones? The one that's been there 15 years. Was there a specific question? Is there a way that you were able to recognize their potential?
I think, you know, because so much of what we did was based on storytelling and authenticity. That's, it's that authenticity that we looked for in our staff. So it wasn't, somebody who, had 5 years working at Starbucks isn't necessarily going to be what we're looking for. We were never looking for people who were, um, uh, the most skilled at a task. We were looking for people who would embody our warm, welcoming attitude towards customers. Like there's nothing better than when when a customer comes in, especially in a coffee shop environment, and you know what they want, their dog's name, you give them
Right.
a treat for their dog who's standing obediently out by the door, and that's the type of people that we looked for. That's the type of people that stuck around. You're never going to get it 100% right all the time, but we've been pretty lucky with some pretty great staff.
So, on a tactical level, did you find there was like two or three questions that you would ask that would uncover that, or was it just the way they conducted themselves in the interview that showed you that? And what
It
were you
was the
looking
way they
for in that
it,
how they conducted themselves?
being able to have a conversation with
Ah,
somebody. Didn't matter what we were talking about,
yeah,
because again, customer service, it is, that ability to hold a conversation or to strike up a conversation with someone you've never met quickly and create a connection with them. That's key. And the interview is really, sell me sell me that cake.
do you want cake with that coffee? Um, Question then is, I'm curious, as you look back and you go, holy cow, we did this, then we opened this, then we opened this, and we did, like, so it was an intense period of time, I have no doubt, of launching, getting your leaseholds done and then hiring, and those launches are so time intensive. What would you change about that time frame? Looking back, if you had to do it all over again, would you do the same thing or would you change that?
You know, I've done different things in my life, different careers, and I've avoided harping on what could have been.
Yes, for
If I had chosen a different path, I think we make decisions in a day based on the circumstances of the day, and it's mentally it's healthier to just keep looking forward and never look back.
I, I feel that's the same when when I think about my executive MBA time frame because it was so intense. I'm like, if I knew now, would I do it again? I'm not sure. So sometimes ignorance is bliss when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, no, absolutely. Like when I one day I decided we were going to make a sea salt chocolate bar, but it had to be Nova Scotian sea salt, and there was somebody who made Nova Scotian sea salt. And it was ridiculously expensive, but I bought it because we were only using a sprinkle of it on each bar. Became our best-selling bar. Next season, the
everything.
sea salt guy disappeared, and so I said, "Well, if I can't find Nova Scotian sea salt, I'm going to have to make it." And so
Mm.
a friend of mine who was an oyster farmer brought me some nice, clear, clean water from down Antigonish way and started to boil it on the stove. And 24 hours later, when you take 5 gallons of water and boil it in your kitchen, you get about a half a pound of salt.
Okay,
Um, but
but
my wife was not impressed with the the steam in our house in August that was going 24 hours a day. So if I had to do it over again, would I have a Nova Scotian sea salt bar? Maybe not. Maybe not.
or hey, you one of your staff members could maybe boil the water at their house.
Yeah, I don't think I
There's
wouldn't
some
wish
fun.
that one on anybody.
Where does your creativity come from? Where does this spark of doing it differently come from?
Um, it's funny. I probably picked, my first career, I probably picked the least likely career for someone that's creative. And I will say, like, I was never artistic, um, never musical, but from a very early age, I was enthralled by the ability to um, get someone to buy something because you packed it differently, moved it around the store, changed the price, like whatever. And I think that was sort of the early part of my creativity. Um, and then once we had our own businesses, it was just on a larger scale. Like I could see, okay, if I create this new T-shirt, um, it'll either sell or it won't. But when I walk down the street and I see that on somebody, I just get really engaged, really energized by it. And so it just fed itself.
Right.
And every time I would, do a new product or, change a logo or do something, and you could see the impact right away, it just made me want more and more and more.
That's fascinating. So to me, like it's about curiosity almost like, what about this and what about that? And
Yep.
so I have two questions. One is around how did you normalize failure? And two, did you have any sort of screening process or a gate that an idea had to go through before you went full on?
Um, the normalizing failure part was probably
Mm,
the toughest thing. Um, Again, because everything was so personal.
yeah.
And I was talking to an entrepreneur a couple of nights ago, and he's recently lost his business,
Hmm.
and he's really, really struggling with that, and to the point where he's not really leaving the house. And it can be very isolating. There's no question about it. Being an entrepreneur is not for everybody, and I think knowing it all, knowing how ugly it can get beforehand would probably scare most sane people away.
Mm-hmm.
So to a certain extent, ignorance is bliss on that side. But it's challenging. It's a very, very challenging situation when a business is not succeeding, or even worse, failing. And I don't know that you can normalize that.
Yeah.
But again, you got to move past it and move on, and start again, or do something different. Um, as for the screen,
Yeah.
the number one thing that I've always said to people is, on when you're looking at your revenue, and you're basically throwing a dart at the wall. Um, I've seen so many people come up with a number that I'm not sure what it was ever based on, but it's a big round number. So let's say it was $100,000 a month in sales. Um, what I've always insisted on being able to do is to break that down into its component
Mm.
parts, right? So it's $3,300 a day. It's
Right.
$300 an hour. That means you need to process 60 customers at $5 a
Mm.
customer.
Yeah.
It's breaking it down to the absolute lowest common denominator, and then you can actually start to stress test some of those ideas. Like,
Right.
can I actually sell, 100 rum cakes a day? If I do sell 100 rum cakes a day, what does the packaging
Mm-hmm.
look like?
What's your
What's my
capacity? Can I
what's my
bake 100
capacity?
cakes a day?
Yeah. The funny story. The first time we ordered our tins for our rum cakes, we had never actually created the cake before we started construction. Um, so started
Build
with the
it, it will
store,
come.
started with the story, and then eventually fine tuned the cake. But then when we came to the packaging, I said, okay, well, I want to sell X, but I insisted on it being in a tin can, and tin cans come from far away. They were coming from Illinois at the time. Like, we'll say, how many cans do you want? I'm like, 10,000 sounds like a good number.
How much
um,
room does
and,
it take up?
well, I got them delivered to my house,
Oh,
and
this is right up there
tin
with the
can.
Steam story, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Thankfully, my wife stuck with me. Not sure why, but I can tell you that a two-car garage in a modern house is 10,000 cans
Oh,
big.
nice. Okay. Good to know.
Not not 10,020, and like every single can fit in, and not one more. Um, but it was
How long did it take you
dumb.
to go through 10,000 cans?
A year
A year.
or a season.
A
A
season.
season.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's so interesting about all of that. Um, you talked about numbers, and I think that there's a number of entrepreneurs I look at from the personal finance perspective, the value of their business, and how they're running their business. I feel like there's a lot of people kind of afraid of the numbers or just not willing to dig in and engage with them. When you talk to somebody like that, how do you position it or help them understand or encourage them to spend that time with their numbers?
Well, I mean, I think the at the end of the day, it's all numbers.
Yeah.
Um, and if they don't understand the numbers, they're probably the only reason they're going to succeed is by luck.
Mm,
Um, it's especially some of the businesses we are in. They were games of pennies,
right.
and when the cup, the lid, and the Java jacket on a cup of coffee costs more than the actual beans. You need to know that. You need to be on top of every single thing, um, and and again, it'll catch up to you very, very quickly if you're not on top of the numbers. And I don't know how more you could um,
Encourage.
beat that through someone's head, but
I often
it's
think that numbers tell their own story in a different way. And so getting enamored of the story that you want them to tell and what they are telling might be one way to actually start looking at them.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
If you were talking to someone who is 50 plus, they've been in their business a while, what is your piece of advice about selling and or starting to think about the end game with their business?
I think it's about getting your house in order,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that again you've got a clean set of financial statements, a story that you can a clean story that you can tell. Get rid of any of the dead wood, whether it's physical or human, or just make some of the decisions that you've been putting off to deal with things. Deal with them long before you're going to look to sell,
Yeah.
because otherwise it's just going to be a negative adjustment to your value that will have a multiplier, right? So
Right. Yes.
if it's $100 problem today and you can get rid of $100 problem, it might be $300 or $400 on the valuation that you're going to pick up.
Right.
And so dealing with it earlier rather than later is going to pay off in spades.
It really, really is. Well, Gord, it has been fascinating talking to you and learning more about your journey and the things you've done with some really remarkable businesses along the way. So I want to thank you for your time today. I think the real bottom line here is creativity and being aware that it can be play a big part in your business as a visionary is so key to your business.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Well, it's just a summary of yours, so we worked it. Thanks, Gord.
Thanks, Wendy. Great talking to you.